Welcome back to Performance Process, the podcast that breaks down the processes behind the world's best performances so that you can apply them to your own riding. Today's show, well, it's a little less performance process focused and, well, equally or even more important, focused on our own health. Today's guest is someone who has been doing some of the most important work in cycling when it comes to understanding injuries. Thomas Fallon is a researcher at Queen's University Belfast, and his work focuses on injury and illness surveillance in professional cycling. He was part of the first ever large-scale study tracking over 1 million kilometres of racing and training to assess how often pro cyclists get injured and sick, and what's been missing in terms of athlete safety. One of his biggest areas of focus is on concussion, a topic that, well, quite frankly, cycling doesn't take seriously enough. His research has shown that while road cycling has the highest rate of head, neck and face injuries of any cycling discipline, it also has one of the lowest reported rates of concussions. That should be a massive red flag. In most other sports, concussion protocols have become standard with strict return to play rules, sideline assessments and real-time monitoring. But in cycling, riders crash, get back on the bike and keep racing. Today, we're going deep into Thomas's research to figure out why cycling gets concussion so wrong, what needs to change, and how riders, both pro and amateur, can better understand the risks, symptoms, and recovery process. So, I really do think this is one that applies to all of us. Thomas, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I think you're probably the closest guest I've ever had to home in this podcast. You're a fellow Irishman. I was expecting you to be calling in from somewhere in the same country here, but actually you're over in Edinburgh at the moment, so still pretty close to home for me. Do you want to kick us off just by giving the listeners a bit of your own background and how you got into cycling?
Yeah, so I suppose I've been cycling. I was cycling in Ireland for a number of years, from up through underage into junior, senior ranks, and would have completed on the track for a couple of years during the World Cups, right up, I suppose, up to the back of the qualification period for Rio. And I done an undergrad in sports science and exercise physiology in Ireland, then moved over to the UK to Edinburgh, done a master's there in physio, and then I further specialised within musculoskeletal physio and worked as a clinical specialist in Edinburgh as a clinical specialist in musculoskeletal physiotherapy in between GP surgeries and primary care. And I all along have worked within sport, within cycling from a physio point of view. So I work with most recently, I suppose, at the Paralympics as a physiotherapist with the Irish team, and we enjoyed considerable success there. And then supported the Irish team, elite team, at the World Championships in Zurich. And I'm also doing a PhD then within PhD in medicine through Queen's University, which I'm in my second year of. Was writing it up now. PhD is looking at developing injury and illness surveillance within competitive cycling, professional cycling. So effectively, we're just developing a system, an injury surveillance system. So we've collaborated with the UCI on a couple of projects. So we carried out injury surveillance at the World Championships that happened here in the UK a couple of years ago, and we published some work around the injuries that we've seen in downhill mountain biking, and then some of the work that you've mentioned that we've done with UnoX recently around the injuries we've seen within the pro game.
Well, yeah, sounds like you're quite busy.
Sounds busy when you say it. No, it doesn't feel too busy. It sounds busy.
That work with UnoX, it's quite something. We're definitely going to have you back on the podcast to discuss that in more detail. Today, we're here to discuss concussions. You've done quite a bit of research on concussion. I'm curious to what kind of drew you down that path.
Yeah, so I think, well, I myself had a couple in my time, but I definitely had a bad crash a good few years ago now, in France, and in reflection, I definitely had a very bad concussion. You know, I couldn't stand up because I was getting sick when I stood up. I remember they transferred me at one point between hospitals, and on transfer I lost consciousness. So but at no point on reflection. And I think I'm probably guilty myself of not volunteering some of the symptoms as well, you know, but at no point did anyone mention to say you had a concussion, or that I can recall. And I think, so that was one thing. But then I done my master's thesis around examining the knowledge and the attitudes of athletes around concussion. So we found then within that the younger athletes were more willing to hide the symptoms associated with concussion than older athletes. So they were more willing to take risk. And I suppose if we think of it, the diagnosis of concussion is based a lot of the diagnosis of concussion is based off symptom presentation. So if they're willing to hide the symptoms of concussion, it challenges a medical professional to diagnose the concussion. And it also then, I suppose, focuses the intervention around increasing people's awareness of the injury. So I presented that at the start of the Tour de France at Cycling and Science Conference a couple of years ago now. I think it was 2021 or 22, or before that even, in Copenhagen. Yeah, presented that there at the Cycling Science Conference. And yeah, from then I was also I was part of the development of what was the athlete development program in Cycling Ireland, which was a program that was developed with a working relationship with Sport Ireland Institute. So it was the first kind of real working relationship Cycling Ireland had with the underage athletes. So normally Sport Ireland Institute would have worked directly with the elites and the carded athletes, but this was a program where that the underage, so from under 18 down, from between 16 and 18, they got input from the service providers from Sport Ireland. So they'd be the same service providers that if they were to run through the ranks, progress through the ranks, that they'd be in contact with when they were senior. And this was educational. It was basically like an educational program, but part of that education program was concussion education, which was delivered by some of the Sport Ireland Institute staff. And we use kind of examples within the pro cycling, cultural examples, and we also use quotes from kind of role models for the riders of challenges that they've had. So I think it highlighted the importance of that when riders speak out, they might be given an interview, but they're also given an example for educational content for younger riders coming up, which has values that they probably didn't even consider. So yeah, we ran that. That's probably more concussion stuff that I was involved with.
Oh, it's my pleasure to have you here. I'm going to start with a bit of a story for you, because the last time that I rode the Ross, which is for international listeners, it's effectively the amateur Tour of Ireland these days, and rolling out through the neutral section on one of the stages, a rider that both you and I know, I'm not going to name any names, I'm not going to name and shame, I don't think that helps anyone, but this rider had crashed the day before. I asked him how he was. He said he thought he had a concussion, and when I asked him did he not get that checked, his answer was no, because if the doctor told him he did have a concussion, he wouldn't be allowed to start that day's stage, which I think gets us to the crux of why this is such an important conversation.
Yeah, I think so. And it also gets to the crux of how multifaceted and the cultural components that I suppose influence the challenges that cycling faces too, which is a piece I think that we'll have a chat about.
We certainly will, yeah. Perhaps the best place to kick us off is just if I ask you maybe what is a concussion?
Yeah, so effectively like a concussion is a type of mild traumatic brain injury, and it really is caused by a blow or a jolt to the head, or a violent shaking of the upper body, and basically it disrupts the normal function of the brain, which leads to a normally short-lived neurological deficit. Effectively, say when you do have an impact, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a direct impact to the brain, but you could fall or you could have a jolt or a shift, and basically what happens is you'll have an axonal shear or a shear within your head. And this causes damage to the brain at a microscopic level. And basically, with this impact, then the sudden movement causes stretch to the brain cells. Effectively, that's the best way to put it. That stretch to the brain cells basically leads to small little electrical disruption. So the normal brain's activity, it's affected basically. So how efficient the signals are transmitted to different areas. And that's what gives us this short-lived neuro deficit. And effectively with that then comes chemical changes, because obviously when you have an axonal shear, you can imagine some of the axon ends will be open, the chemicals can flood into that space. So we have chemical changes happening there. So increase in the chemical balances. And then sometimes you can have changes in blood flow disruption. That all then can potentially link with the swelling and pressure in the brain. And then that's why I suppose a combination or in isolation of those couple of factors is what gives you the symptomology that I suppose diagnoses a concussion. And the challenge is our diagnosis of a concussion is based on symptom presentation. Initially, we screen based off symptom presentation, and then the subsequent steps within the SCAT-6 are a lot of them are based around cognitive functions, vestibular functions, oculomotor functions, and it's all symptom driven. So yeah.
For whatever reason, it's taken us cycling, myself included, a long time to perhaps fully appreciate and respect the seriousness of concussions. Part of that might be because it's like an invisible injury, but one thing that you just said there that particularly stood out to me was stretching brain cells. That, for whatever reason, that really hit home for me. Do you want to maybe just expand on that a bit?
If you think of your axons within the brain like small pieces of string, basically, and if you have a helmet on and you have your head inside the helmet, and then your brain's inside your head. But if you take an impact, then you can have a kind of a rotational shear, and that will lead to a stretch of the axons, because your brain is a load of different layers. It's like an onion, okay, and communicating each layer would be the axons. So you can imagine if the second layer of the onion rotates slightly on impact, it's going to stretch what's joining layer 1 and layer 2, and that's what then leads to the small bit of disruption that we get, and that's also then what leads to then the chemical changes that can happen, and then that's what predisposes to swelling and the pressure, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, you've got to a question that I thought was really important in this podcast, and that is like, what happens to the brain during a concussion? Is during even the right terminology? Is it during the concussion? Is it during an impact? Or what are we talking about here?
Well, I suppose on the impact, so it doesn't need to be a direct impact, but on the impact or on the event, what happens? You have that rotational shear, and then subsequent to that, then obviously you'll have the increase of the increase in different cellular byproducts, and as a result of the increase in the various different cellular byproducts, that basically, if you imagine you have a symptom threshold. And if you have all these different cellular byproducts, such as glutamate or potassium, flooding into this space, what happens is it bumps you up closer to the threshold. And then also then you can have an impaired blood flow to the area, to the brain. And then that's what gives you, or can kind of predispose the headaches or this kind of cognitive type of symptomology that comes with it, and also then links in potentially the swelling that happens in the brain, basically.
You mentioned it doesn't have to be a direct impact. What other kinds of ways can a concussion happen in?
Yeah, so it can happen through like a whiplash type of movement. So I think if, say, for example, like a downhill mountain biker, I think one piece of research we done a couple of years ago, downhill mountain biking at the World Championships. If you think a downhill mountain biker is going down a hill at a fast race, and they're from a female, a downhill mountain bike athlete, there's no female specific helmets. So if you think they have 1.2 kilos, as a male does, 1.2 kilos of a helmet weight, roughly speaking, on their head. So again, if you think as they're flying down a hill, their head will be going through different rapid movements. If they don't have adequate neck strength to support that helmet or to stabilize their head, combined with the weight of the helmet, combined with the G forces of going down the hill at 60 odd mile an hour, well then that type of movement can potentially predispose subtle symptomology. All it takes then is basically, for example, for them to crash, not a big massive crash, for then the helmet plus the crash plus the speed to then create an environment where they have enough of an impact to have concussive symptoms. But then also, I think that kind of links into the rotational piece, and then you can also have like the direct impacts. So the direct impacts that you have on the rider on the road, for example, is racing along at 30 mile an hour, and they crash and they hit their head off the ground, like what we'll see if you Google it, you'll see that full impact with the head contra coupe mechanism of injury, where the head basically hits the ground, and the contra coupe is when it comes back and the brain bounces off the other side, basically, and that's a contra coupe mechanism of injury. So there'd be the three kind of main ways that you can just have a head injury. But they're in rugby, for example. There can be other ways, where it can be, which links into the whiplash type of mechanism, so for example, which was a big change in the tackle height rules as well, in where they target and so on and so forth. So I think they're the three kind of categories that I broadly would fit them into diagnostically, if I was seeing someone.
Those all sound pretty severe. It kind of has me wondering why concussions can sometimes go unnoticed.
Mm-hmm. I suppose the challenge is environmental in some senses. Within road cycling, it's completely different to within downhill mountain biking, which is completely different to cross country, which is different to enduro, which is something that we'll catch up on in a few minutes. But I think the other piece is that the symptomology of concussion is transient. So basically, it may not present on the impact or at the location. So basically, for example, you could be crashing along or you could be cycling along today, you could have a crash. And it might not be a massive bounce. You could just have a bounce off the ground. You think, geez, yeah, I'm not too bad. Just a bit of a scuff on my shoulder, my elbow. Didn't hit my head. Helmet looks fine. Rode home that evening. You think, a bit of a headache or a bit of a pressure in my head, and you're a bit more irritable. Just out of sorts. And then the next morning, then you go to sleep that night. A bit of a broken sleep. Don't think much about it. Get up the next morning. You have a banging headache. And then you go to work. You sit in front of a blue light. You sit in front of a computer, blue light screen, and you're struggling to concentrate. Then by that evening, or by the middle of the day, then you're feeling tired, and sometimes you can feel a bit dizzy or you're feeling a bit nauseous. So then, if you think you had the impact, felt fine, you got home, you felt a little bit worse, but not too bad. Went to bed, a bit broken, but not too bad. Got up next day, went to work, felt a bit worse, and then by the next day, you were shown all the symptoms that would be suggestive of a concussion. Now, if you went to a GP and you said you felt a bit of nausea and you felt a bit of a headache, but you didn't give them any context about what you'd done the day before, they might say, oh, you have a head cold. So that's where context is important. So it's important that if you do go for follow-up or evaluation by a medical professional, you give them context as to what you've been doing in the days preceding your attendance or your kind of presentation, should we say, because it can present over time. And that's why, as well, from a diagnostic point of view, I think we have on-site evaluation. So what we, as in road cycling is challenging because you don't get to be on-site a lot of the time, but you've on-site evaluation. So that's, okay, how are they presenting? Then you have your post-event evaluation, how are they then? And you have the next day evaluation. And I think there's a RIDE protocol that was proposed by a colleague of mine, which kind of, I suppose, adopts that process and applies it to cycling. And I think in rugby, that's what they do. Now, I suppose the challenge is the technology piece if we want it, but yeah.
Yeah, we'll certainly get onto that in a bit. I mean, what you described there is something I've experienced firsthand, literally within the last few weeks, in that I had a high-speed crash recently. Obviously hit my head during the crash because the helmet was damaged and actually cracked. But I had no symptoms immediately post-ride. I had no intentions of continuing in the event either. I sort of was, well, the bike was broke, but I was also aware that I'd hit my head, and I was keen to get a concussion check done, having recently looked into the seriousness of this and being, just my own understanding has improved of late. But the next morning, actually, I woke up and I developed a headache then, and that got progressively worse, and I started feeling like nauseous and that also, and to the point that like a full 36 hours post-crash, I then checked myself into hospital, and I'd passed several concussion checks. I had a CT scan done when I was at the hospital, and everything was fine. But I still have this lingering question. It's kind of twofold, and that is, why do the symptoms sometimes take so long to come on, and can you pass all those tests and still have a concussion that you need to respect?
Yeah, you can. I think you've got to, like, your example is a prime example of what we see. And I think another prolific example would be 2 weeks ago, as the Scottish rugby player Finn Russell, who had a bad enough impact on the pitch, passed his HIA, so his head injury assessment. So he was taken off. In rugby, what they'll do is you see the impact, video analysis also sees the impact, make a decision, independent match doctor reviews them, and he passed assessment by the independent mass doctor. Then he was sitting right in the dugout, ready to go back on, and basically they coaching staff determined that he wasn't himself, that he wasn't remembering plays, or he was just a bit out of sorts, and they didn't put him back on. Put him onto a concussion return to sport pathway. So I think that's kind of a prime example of how it's even the top sports in the world, in the sense of, from a concussion point of view, that are leading the way in a lot of what we do, how they're even relying on the whole piece of, people that know you need to be able to know that you've had an impact, and also that you need to know what normal is cognitively, and you can blag your way through a concussion symptom test, and a lot of people who have done a load of them will be able to rhyme off what they should rhyme off, which is challenging. Other side of it is that the subtle symptomology means that you may not be, because you might only have one or two of the symptoms that are on a 30 symptom scale, you may not be scoring high on those. You may actually, at the scoring, not be scoring that high overall. Yeah, I think the reporting of it is another challenge. Whether or not you'd be happy to, like what you said there, some riders will finish the race and be like, oh, that's me now, I'm next stage, perfect race finish, cross the line, no one's going to go near me now, which some people then are speaking out about.
Yeah, perhaps that's an opportunity just to sort of delve into this, because I think a lot of riders assume if they have mild symptoms, or if they can finish a stage or whatever, they are fine. But what are the additional risks of having potentially had a concussion? Is the risk just that you get another one, or is there other risks also?
Yeah, so like you've with that, so if you, for example, have an impact, so you crash in a race and at kilometre 50 and 200k stage, you get back on the bike and the bunch is moving along steady enough. That crash was enough to give you a subconcussive impact, say, for example. So you weren't presenting with a load of symptoms associated with concussion, or sometimes you may have been. The challenge is that all those cellular elevations that we mentioned earlier on, and all the excitation from a cellular point of view that happens as a result, that gives you the symptoms that you present with. Basically, if you think they've all bumped your threshold up, okay? If you have a second impact, this then basically can cause rapid swelling of the brain, effectively, and this can lead to severe complications, potentially leading to permanent brain damage, or even you can as a result you could just basically lose consciousness. That second impact syndrome is something that people aren't fully aware of, and it's something that is quite serious. And the other piece is that riders will find that they might be fine when they have the crash. Then they get back on the bike and they get back up to an intensity, and the intensity of the race, or as the race starts to reach a certain intensity, or as towards the back end of the race starts to that intensity is starting to bring on a symptom, and it's that point they're like, I don't feel right here. And then you can because symptom, obviously, if you think there's a link between your brain, our body requires blood flow. Our brain is the center of command, basically, if we consider it in the sense of what we do. So as a result of that, then, if we have an increase in blood flow and we also have a brain injury, we can see then the link between exertion, which requires greater blood flow, and symptoms. And then you have also the cognitive piece that comes with it. So, for example, if a rider crashes, we know that there's a short-lived neurological deficit, and there's vestibular component to concussion. So what, in the sense of balance, there's an oculomotor sense, in the sense of visual disturbances. So between the vestibular oculomotor symptoms, so they're short for VOM symptoms, you could have balance disturbances and coordination disturbances, and as a result, then you won't be as stable on two wheels. So then when the race really does start racing, and we have all the complications of the traffic islands, speed bumps, diversions, not diversions. The challenge is then that you hit a traffic island, and it's not, you've hit the traffic island because you haven't got the coordination, because you've had a head impact 50k before or 100k before. Yeah, and then you risk. Then the thing is, say for example you don't have anything, okay, and you're symptom free. The end of the stage finished, you're like, grand, got away with that. or you don't know anything about it. That's the other piece. Is it the biggest challenge is actually when riders do know, they don't necessarily, the pros aren't hiding the symptoms. They know the risks because they're educated on the risks. But say, for example, if you think, geez, yeah, I started the tour, I'm stage 2, I don't want to go home. I might feel better the next day, or I'll do the next few stages. They're easier stages. Challenge is that if you have repetitive subconcussive incidences, that you risk longer term. There's a longer term risk there in chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is something that, say, we're starting to know more about and associate with longer term neurodegenerative conditions, and that's coming out of University of Glasgow and Professor Willie Stewart's clinic, where basically they've associated CTE, so chronic traumatic encephalopathy, with footballers, and what they're suggesting is that it's the repetitive microtrauma or subconcussive incidences of hitting the ball, and the ball was heavier back then, and it's the small elevations in that of activity that we mentioned at the very start, that the pathophysiology of concussion basically that has worn down how myelinated. So if you think there's an insulation around every axon, has worn down. Worn down that basis leads to the neurodegeneration, and that then leads to chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And because the ball was heavier, so then obviously if they're hitting the ball, then it's a heavier ball. And I think the other piece of it, lastly, would be that now they have in Scotland, they've brought in that there's a ban on hitting footballs for underage. So like they're saying, well, it's not. Yeah, I think it's outright. You need to check if it's. They're definitely discouraging it. They're definitely regulating it. They're regulating it. That's the word.
Interesting. Yeah, I know in football, somewhere in football, they have advised players who have had a head injury don't head the ball in training for X number of days after. I'm not exactly aware of the exact protocol there, but I wasn't aware of an outright ban at underage level.
Yeah, no, at underage level, definitely. Yeah, I think it's at underage level they're changing the regulation around heading the ball. Within Scotland, yeah, Scottish FA have done that, and there's also like grassroots. The return to sport for younger athletes is longer than the return to sport for older athletes, even when symptom free. They're all things that you have to consider in the wider piece. The return to sport for a para-athlete is longer than the return to sport for an able-bodied cyclist, for example, and then the return to sport for a junior will be different to the return to sport for a senior.
Yeah, you mentioned the immediate risks of continuing right after concussion, delayed reaction time, impaired decision making, and which just increase your chances of crashing again. But longer term, if I understand correctly, there may well be links between concussions and depression and other mental health issues in later years.
Yeah, I think there is research to show there's changes in depression, or there's changes in symptoms associated with depression and anxiety post concussion, and you can get a syndrome called post concussion syndrome, basically where symptoms persist over a duration of time of, I think it's 3 months is the timeline to diagnose. I think it's the timeline to diagnose post-concussion syndrome. And basically the symptoms associated with the concussion, the first instance, like headache, dizziness, fatigue, cognitive impairment, they persist for that length of time. They also link in with the feeling of hopelessness and frustration. And then obviously that you can see the direct link that has with depression and anxiety. And I think, unfortunately, we have seen a case of this in cycling a couple of years ago in Kelly Caitlin, and who was a US track rider whose father spoke out around the potential link between post-concussion syndrome and his daughter's suicide. And there's no direct, it's just a discourse around the topic, and more so an increase in awareness around it as well in an unfortunate sequence of events. But I think the challenge we have is that cyclists and athletes are high-performing individuals, and high-performing individuals are have a tendency to be perfectionists. And as a result, then we will critique ourselves intrinsically. And when you have post-concussion syndrome or something like that, or symptoms associated with that over long periods of time, it can lead to frustration. You can lead to, why I'm able to perform, why I'm able to do my efforts at top intensity because I'm getting a headache every time I do them. Why am I struggling to concentrate at this level, and so on and so forth. Why can't I do study and train? And this can lead to frustration, feeling the hopelessness, and over time that can wear people down. And that's where the suicidal ideation comes in, and so that's another piece that's very important to acknowledge. And then obviously the CTE, and then it all comes back to the sleep disturbances that you can have in the days after a concussion, and then the longer term sleep disturbances, and how that impacts mood, how that impacts irritability, how that impacts quality of life, and so on. From something that starts as something that you might think, oh, it's not a scar, it's not, I can't see it. It can have a cascade of effects if it's not adequately managed.
CTE is chronic traumatic, and I'm going to let you say the E part because I can't pronounce that word.
Encephalopathy.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm laughing here, but obviously it's no laughing matter or nothing to make light of in any way. And yeah, I just think that's exactly the motivations behind this episode of the podcast. It's, as I said at the start, it's not a process that you can apply to your training or performance immediately, but it's something that, yeah, if we respect concussions and look after ourselves post concussion, because crashes are inevitable in cycling, that may, it's immeasurable, but that may well mean we can keep performing for much longer or avoid much more extended periods on the sidelines, so to speak. Okay, folks, that's where we're cutting off the free version of this podcast this week. Just a reminder, if you head over to escapecollective.com/member, you can sign up now and you can get the entire podcast uninterrupted. You'll not have me butting in to cut you off or to remind you that you're not yet a member. And in doing so, you will be helping to ensure this podcast continues for many more episodes and months and years to come. So head over escapecollective.com/member now to sign up to Escape Collective and to get the entire episode of Performance Process, along with all of the other podcasts and written content that we publish on our website.